Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast as we continue to talk some NBA here. Just wrapped up talking about the Cavaliers' plans with Evan Mobley, but I want to shift gears here to the San Antonio Spurs, who have had a pretty good offseason in my eyes, where, through the draft, obviously, having 2 picks in the top 8, they had a chance to, add a lot of potential to the roster. Ultimately, they draft Stephon Castle, one of my favorite prospects, with the 4th overall pick, and then ended up trading that 8th pick for, 2030 and 31, I think it was, swaps, which had me pretty disappointed because the 8th pick ended up being Rob Dillingham, and I would have loved to see him with Wembanyama as well. But the fact that they made this type of a move sort of led to a chain events here where they were able to have a little bit more cap space, and they end up bringing in Chris Paul on a 1-year deal worth $11 million. And then additionally, for the cost of, I think they might have thrown in a 2nd round pick, years down the road, they got Harrison Barnes as well, who is a player that, obviously his best days are past him, and you say the same thing about Chris Paul as well, but, players that still have been around, they've been around winning. I know that Chris Paul hasn't won a ring necessarily, but obviously, was on countless playoff teams, was the starting point guard and, debatably best player on the Suns at least at that time that they were there. And you go out and get Harrison Barnes too, who, again, his better years are behind him, but he's played in 82 games in 2 straight years, started, all 164 of them, is an efficient scorer, of course, won the championship with the Warriors all those years ago. So it is something that is really interesting to, see how this all is going to, play out in the long run, because the Spurs last year were in a position that they just didn't really have they didn't have enough talent around the young phenom of Victor Wembanyama, and they were trying out a bunch of different, almost basketball experiments throughout the course of the year. Of course, Jeremy Sohan being one of the biggest ones there, but that just did not work. And there was just a lack of, competent options around him. Now, I'm a big fan of Devin Vassell, and I think that he is also somebody that they can, build around to some degree. Him and Wembanyama can be a really nice 1-2 punch. Keldon Johnson, unfortunately, took a big step backwards. I was a big fan of him for his first couple years, but just did not have the season that the Spurs were hoping for. And, Chris Paul last year, when you look at his stint with the Warriors, he was dealing with injuries early in the year as well, which sort of limited him being able to really establish himself in that rotation necessarily with the Warriors. He played in 58 games, played about 26 minutes per game, but he was more of a bench option for them, and I'm curious to see whether or not they are ultimately going to start him. Again, it's kind of weird because you look at the fact that you're talking about Chris Paul, who is going to be an undoubted, first ballot Hall of Famer, but also at this point, I don't know. I mean, who do you think is better at this point, Trey Jones or Chris Paul? I think the fact that we're even having that conversation is substantial for sure, but at the same time, Chris Paul is just a presence that I think is going to have a very real impact on the Spurs. And Paul spoke to the media a couple days ago, and he talked about how he came to play basketball. He didn't come to coach, and he's focused on himself and trying to have a better season. He would like to grab back some of the magic that we saw from him from years. Now, I don't know if I'd necessarily be putting my bank account on that happening, but I still think that Chris Paul is just going to be an addition for this Spurs team that is going to be very substantial in terms of, minimum just having players around him, having guards that can make the proper passes and put him up in, positions to succeed. And that's with Paul, that is with Stephon Castle, where again, I do hope that Paul does lean a little bit into the mentorship role. Now, if he wants to go out and get his, I 100% stand with that. I wouldn't expect anything less from a competitor like him, but Stephon Castle is a prospect that really feels like if he could develop some of those more traditional point guard skills as well, that his ceiling is extremely high, and I would love to see him, be willing to do that. So we'll see there. They end up taking Nunez in the second round as well, point guard from Spain that is actually on the Spain team. Curious to see whether or not he gets any run time, but it's something that I'm at least curious about there because he's known as a very good pick and roll ball handler, and that would be something that would be very impactful for the future of Wemby's career, where again, it's just a matter of actually having players around him that can make the right basketball play. And again, I feel like I'm in a little bit of a weird spot with Jeremy Sochan. I've talked about it before. I was never really all that high on him, and now after this past year, because everybody is so fixated on Wembanyama and they want, the best for him possible, that it wasn't Sochan's fault that Popovich decided to run him at the point guard and try out that failed experiment. That now everybody thinks he's, a bum. I don't think it's that far, but I also don't have that much faith in him myself. So a little bit of a weird dynamic there, at least for me internally, when talking about the evaluation of this Spurs core. But, being able to add two legitimate veterans who know what they're doing on a basketball court is going to put the Spurs in a decent position. Now, you look at the Western Conference and you really can't feel like the Spurs have all that much of a chance to, top, especially in this deep West, make their way into a play-in spot. But you look at some of the other teams in the Western Conference and, you look at the very bottom. We'll see what the Jazz end up doing in terms of whether or not they move on from Lauri Markkanen. But, you have the Trailblazers in there as well. I think that there is maybe a possibility that the Spurs could at least be hovering a little bit in that range that the Rockets were last year of being a well-coached team, having some really nice youth talent, bringing in a couple veterans in the offseason, and ultimately falling short, but at least, playing meaningful basketball into, like 80% of the way through the season. Talk about, into March, still at least having hope of making the playoffs. Now, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here. Obviously, it very much depends on the development of Victor Wembanyama, who people are sort of racing to give him top 10 status in the league. Now, I understand why that would be the case. I still want to, at least see it play out a little bit more before I'm ready to just pencil him in to top 10 perennially. But we're probably, on the brink of that at this point, where he's a top 20. You can't name me 20 players in the NBA that are better than Victor Wembanyama, in my opinion. So, and again, considering the circumstances that were around him, I had this debate with a friend of mine on the 4th of July about, how many players actually could have taken that Spurs team last year to a play-in tournament spot. I don't think the list is longer than 3. I think it is probably just Nikola Jokic, Giannis Antetokounmpo, and Luka Doncic, and that is probably it. And this was a 22-win team, even with Wembanyama being as special as he was. So, I don't know. I have very high hopes for the Spurs this year. Not in terms of actual contention, but I think they're going to have to be, a borderline league pass team that you're putting on a nightly basis when they are playing. But, again, I don't want to go overboard here in terms of the Wembanyama excitement and put him and the Spurs into conversations that they're just not ready to be in yet. But I love what they did this offseason in terms of just adding enough competence around the core that they have, and they're still multiple pieces away, but as long as you believe in Wembanyama, the prospect, where I don't think I've met anybody who doesn't believe in him at this point, that they are going to be in a very good position for years to come. But let me know how you feel, where you think the Spurs end up lining up in the overall hierarchy of the Western Conference, and whether or not you think Chris Paul will have a big impact on the team. But we are going to be now diving into the MLB Home Run Derby and the current state of the event. We have the full list of participants that we are going to be diving into, but before we do all of that, we're going to have to take a quick break here. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back.